Hey folks, welcome to part 2 of the Adamic Covenant. The purpose of this was A, to kind of split it up time-wise because the last video was a little bit long, and then also B, conceptually, this does kind of mark like a part 2 of the Adamic Covenant. So remember, just as a quick recap, that the Adamic Covenant is a little bit unclear whether it's actually specifically a covenant, and that has to do with A, the term covenant not being used, and B, the structure of it being a bit of an enigma. But if you were to look at it from a bird's eye view, it generally goes from chaos to order, and now we have in Genesis 3 kind of that reinstitution of chaos, and it's going to be the laws, or rather the judgments that God gives at this point that kind of mark the Adamic Covenant, that the state that we're still living in. So here, as we said before, we have the fall of humanity taking place, and you really see this in Genesis 3:1, where now you're introduced to the animal kingdom, and you have this serpent. You have the dominion of the animal kingdom, and you have the serpent who's kind of exercising power over the woman. Now, if you actually go to Genesis 2:25, which is the last verse in Genesis 2, and Genesis 3:1, you see an interesting wordplay taking place. It says, "And the man and the wife were both, naked," which is arumim in Hebrew, and this term is actually used later on in Genesis. It's used in Genesis 42:18, where it speaks about vulnerability, when Joseph saw the vulnerability of the land of Egypt. So here the term nakedness means vulnerability between the man and the woman, so there was a close, intimate relationship, and they were not ashamed. Now notice here, v'hanachash, so you have an offline clause taking place. So it's kind of like, okay, at the same time that they have the arumim happening, the nakedness, you have a serpent who was more arum, who was more crafty. So notice the parallel between these. The words themselves are extremely similar, and so you can see the parallel going on where the arum of the serpent is going to take the arumim away from from man and woman. So you see right from the get-go something fishy is happening, and you're going to see the dominion of the serpent taking place. Now, as an aside, the term crafty arum is not necessarily bad. In Proverbs 12, we're actually told to be crafty, we're told to be arum, but here, obviously, the serpent uses it for evil. And so eventually the serpent, he deceives a woman. Did God really say? Doubting God's word. And then what the woman does in turn is she paints God more as a suppressor rather than a protector. And she adds laws that God never said. God didn't actually say you should never touch the tree, and yet that's what she claimed that God said. And so the first thing that we have here is the dominion of the animal kingdom over mankind. So that first pillar we spoke about, remember, it was God and man, God and the woman, God and the serpent, or the animal kingdom. The first one is turned upside down. The second one, man and the woman, is turned upside down as well, as you see their fellowship being broken as well. In Genesis 3:7 rather, it says that the eyes of both of them were open after they took of the tree. The eyes of both of them were open, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. Now, the notion that their eyes would be open, obviously a major theme is the knowledge of good and evil, and that they will become like gods. And the big question is, well, why would God prevent them from knowing good and evil? Obviously, they had a capacity to determine between good and evil prior to the fall, right? Eve's very conversation, or the woman's very conversation with the serpent, indicates that she knew very well what was right and what was wrong, and so did the serpent. So it's not simply a matter of knowing right and wrong. Rather, what it is, and what we presume it to be, is that it was having the moral autonomy to usurp the authority from God to claim for yourself what is right and what is wrong. And that's what happened with mankind, and that's what you see happening with the Tower of Babel. They're usurping the authority of God to do it themselves. And so with that happening, you see that this broken relationship between the two of them, that this vulnerability happened that kind of divided them. Now they're covering up the thing that allowed them to feel very intimate. And so you could, even when God created Eve, remember Adam was, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, this is amazing. Whereas now when God asked Adam, why did you do this? Adam says, it's the woman that you gave me. Right, so now he's blaming the woman. So he shows the broken fellowship. And then the broken fellowship with God, the third pillar that was turned upside down, the institution of chaos. And this third pillar, God, he asks in Genesis 3:8, where are you? Not necessarily because he wasn't omniscient or he didn't know all things. This is more anthropomorphic language that we use of God in order to understand what he was saying, what he was doing. I think it was more of putting the ball into Adam's court. Kind of saying, hey, we were fellowshipping together, we were walking together. Where are you now? What's happening? And so this segues into the judgment over mankind as well as the animal kingdom. And so God, he goes to Adam and he says, what did you do? Adam says it was the woman's fault. Woman says it was the serpent's fault. And so then God's judgment starts with the serpent, then goes to the woman, and then goes to the man. And so this is, again, kind of like part 2 of the Adamic covenant. These are the stipulations which we live with today, and that we anticipate will be in some form rectified later on in the millennial age. So the first thing is the punishment against the serpent. The Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock, above all the beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go. Now this phrase, on your belly you shall go, here, there's some conversation whether snakes had legs before and then it was taken away from them. This doesn't necessarily imply that. It doesn't need to be that. And you see a parallel with this in the Abrahamic covenant. For example, one of the signs of the Abrahamic covenant was circumcision, right? And that implies that God has a covenant with Adam and his descendants. Well, circumcision was well practiced at that time. God just gave the act a new meaning. In the same way, it's very possible that God just gave the notion that the serpent goes on his belly kind of a new meaning, the fact that he's in a cursed state. The second thing we have is that you're going to eat dust all the days of your life. This notion, you find it also in Micah 7:17, where the enemies of Israel, they're going to lick the dust like the serpent. Again, this means that he's going to be in a humble state. He's going to be in a cursed state. So this focuses on the physical characteristics of the serpent, and then here it's more on the personal characteristics of the serpent. But the major question is this a messianic prophecy? And we're going to have another video that deals with this very question right here, where we address the question, is God really speaking to the serpent, or is he speaking to a source behind the serpent who we believe to be Satan? And so let's just say theoretically he's speaking to the serpent. He says here, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, your offspring, her offspring. He shall bruise you on the head, you shall bruise him on the heel. And so those who claim this is not a messianic prophecy say that this means there's going to be perpetual hatred between serpents and the woman, or the animal kingdom and mankind. So essentially, you have the notion of chaos in the animal kingdom taking place. So the first thing we have is the cursed state of the serpent. And then we go on in verse 16 to the woman. In Genesis 3:16, to the woman, there are really two things going on. You have the pain of childbirth, which is when you put that hand in hand with the be fruitful and multiply, you can see that this is actually a very big judgment. And then the second thing is that she's going to be subjected to her husband. Your desire will be contrary to your husband, he shall rule over you. The notion that your desire will be for your husband is debated. We're not entirely sure what that means, but you do see that in Genesis 4:7, where it says that for Cain, that sin's desire is for you. So it has sinister intentions. So here you have the notion of childbirth, and then you have the notion of a bad relationship between the husband and the wife. And then finally you have the judgment against Adam. And for the judgment against Adam, you have three things. First, that the earth is cursed. So cursed is the ground, and we saw a reference to this in one of the later passages where it speaks about the broken covenant and the curse of the ground. The second thing is that he's going to work by the sweat of his brow, so the fact that we're going to have hard work and hard labor. And then the third, that there's going to be physical death. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Throughout biblical history, there's only two exceptions to this that we actually find, the first being Enoch and the second being Elijah, neither of which died. Nevertheless, this is a major component in human history. So you have the serpent, the woman, and the man. Now, why is this covenant important for us? First, remember that you have chaos going to order and going back to chaos, which is essentially what sin does in our lives. So on a personal note, you can really see the illustration of sin and what it does in our spiritual lives in the creation account. The second thing is that this creation account here provides an etiology. In other words, it really informs us why snakes slither, why giving birth hurts, why man has to work by the sweat of their brow, why people actually die. So to a large extent, you're reading this and you get an understanding of why the world is the way that it is. A third reason why this is important is because it really sets the stage for an anticipation of these curses being reversed. You know, in Romans 8, Paul speaks about creation groaning and wanting to have redemption. And also in Isaiah 65, when it speaks about the millennial age, a lot of these curses are going to be reversed, right? It speaks about that people will not toil in vain. It speaks about that that woman will not it will not be in pain when they give birth. That the seed of the parents will be blessed. And one of the interesting things, actually, if you look at Isaiah 66:25, it says that the dust will still be the serpent's food. So at no point will the Adamic covenant be done away with, that the serpent will be in a perpetually cursed state, at least leading into the millennial age, but some of these other aspects will be reversed. And so that kind of sums up the Adamic covenant. And then finally, we have this notion of Israel and creation. And again, Westerman, I appreciate what he says insofar as that Israel is not some afterthought, not something that just came about in Genesis 12, but rather right from the creation you have these foreshadowings that look forward to the nation of Israel and God's ultimate redemptive plan through them. And so just some things that you could keep in mind. First, you have the notion of Sabbath in the creation account. Now, what's interesting is you don't really hear anything about Sabbath or a sacred time or a sacred day until you get to Israel being established as a nation, and then they are required to observe the Sabbath as a sign of God's creation, which is still done today, obviously. And so you have first the Sabbath, the second the celestial world. We mentioned this before, the notion that God created the sun, moon, stars for understanding the seasons and the times. And so Israel, from Leviticus 23, they're able to observe the calendar. And we know that from Leviticus 23, there's kind of like a plan of redemption that God sets forward that Yeshua fulfills when you read the New Testament. And the notion that, fulfills doesn't mean it's done away with, of course, but it pointed forward to him. It's the ultimate fulfillment in him. And by celebrating them, we still commemorate him. And so you have the celestial world. The third is the Garden of Eden, which really represents land. The fact that Israel is constantly wanting to go to Canaan, wanting to go back into the land. And so the Garden of Eden represents ultimate fellowship, ultimate priesthood with God. And so the land of Canaan represents that as well. So you have this anticipation of land. And then one point that I don't think is really emphasized enough, remember, the earth was kind of started, formless void, full of water, and God separates everything. And that's really what makes order. And in the same way, God calls Israel to be separate, to be distinct, and that's what allows him to be orderly. And so when you have Israel kind of going with the nations, going back, and that's like chaos happening all over again. So what we really see is that the Adamic covenant, it kind of sets the stage for foreshadowing Israel. But keep in mind some of the stipulations that were made, especially Genesis 3:14 through 20, where you have God's judgment on the serpent, the woman, and the man. These are the stipulations that we still live with because of the Adamic covenant.